From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and family, workmates brought the light from the dark. For ships and trains and iron, industry and home, we pull black diamonds from the earth. All hail to King Cole. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. No one talks of danger underneath the ground. We're the heartbeat of this nation, of that we can be proud. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. Now once there was a mine here, but now the pit head's gone. There's no more working underground, but the memory lingers on. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and family, workmates brought the light from the dark. Now the pit is closing, Mother Nature takes a hand. There's no more filthy slag heaps in this green and pleasant land. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. For ships and trains and iron, industry and home, we pull black diamonds from the earth. All hail to King Cole. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and family, workmates brought the light from the dark. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Francis, friends and workmates brought the light from... Bessie just loved being out in the middle of the dew-covered fields in the early morning sunshine. She knew that she shouldn't be here. She'd been told often enough by her mum and dad, and she could hear their stern voices in her head as she danced amongst the buttercups and daisies. But right here, on the edge of the new pit, she felt as happy as a 4-year-old could feel. It had been easy for her to make her way out of the crowded bed at the top of the house, but the squeak of the latch and the creak of the front door had nearly woken everyone in the house. Having to share a room with her 7 brothers and sisters was one thing, but Ginny's elbows were as sharp as an axe when she tossed and turned in her sleep, and Bessie had had enough. Dressing as the sun rose, she was determined that she would go and see her dad as he came home from the mine, and, with her grandma's old teddy under her arm, she started to make her way up the great pile of dusty black coal that made the green of the field look even greener. "You keep me safe, won't you?" She hugged at the worn neck of the small white teddy in her arms. This was a precious toy. In fact, it was the only toy that she had in all of this world, and she took him everywhere with her. As she scrambled on, she reached a flattened place in the great stinking pile of coal, and she could see over the manager's high brick wall and into his beautifully tended garden. It was the yellow of the flowers that first caught her eye, but the smell of the apples, juicy, green and ripe, that cut right through the industrial stench all about her. Sure he wouldn't miss one. Not just one apple. He's got so many, and I've only got... She paused in her thinking out loud as she squeezed the teddy in her arms even more tightly. "I've only got you and my dad." For the moment she had forgotten about the whole of her snoring family, and for the moment she had forgotten about the things she'd been told by her mother and father about stealing. Quick as a blink of an eye, she was down by the fence at the front of the garden and under the rusty wire and into the manager's orchard. The apple trees were groaning under the weight of their rich bounty of fruit, and many had fallen onto the soft green earth below. If she was to pick one up from off the ground, then she didn't have to take it from the tree, and it seemed even less like stealing. Bessie rubbed a fine round green apple on the front of her pinafore dress. She'd been so careful to keep it clean when she'd first got it, but now, what with her adventures on the coal heap, the cotton of its cloth, well, it was streaked with black and grime, but she just didn't care. The apple was now hers, and she was going to give it to her dad. She could imagine the huge, black-rimmed grin on his face as he took a bite out of it, and he rubbed at her tousle hair in the early morning sunlight as they made their way back home together. She had a smile on her face as she slipped out of the garden and started to go across the coal heap once more. Now that she was dirty, she didn't really care if she got any dirtier, and she was dancing in between the huge mounds of coal and making for the field at the side of the pit head. She leapt, she bounced, she skidded and slipped on the shining black lumps of coal. If she had walked slowly and carefully, then she would have made it safely to the other side, but care and safety were words you could never use when Bessie was about. Her mother would laugh at her and scold her. "You, Bessie, you're as clumsy as a cart-horse in a market." It was true. She was clumsy, and now she was slipping in the greasy coal, and it was sliding all around her. First, she couldn't move her legs, and then she was trapped up to her waist. She wanted to be anywhere else but here, and when she couldn't move at all, she let out a great wail of a tear-stained scream that would have woken up the world, if the world had been listening. She was far away from home, and too far away from her friends, and no one could hear her, no one except the farmer. He wasn't too pleased that the pit had dropped all of its coal on his good pasture land, so he was no friend to the coal miners or the managers. Stopping the two great horses in front of him with a click of his tongue and a "Come on, you varmints," he had a curious smile on his face when he saw her. "Well, whatever next? Talk and scream and coal. I've seen many things, but I've never seen coal that could talk." He was laughing now as he took a closer look at her, stuck right up to her waist in the coal. Bessie did look as black as the heaped coals around her, and all that could really be seen of her was the white of her eyes and the pink tear stains down her blackened cheeks. "Please, please, please get me out." Her voice was like a foghorn, but it only made the farmer laugh again. "Why, that's a mighty big voice for such a small girl, but I suppose I'd better get you out before they hoy you on the fire as well." He reached for a lead rope on the bigger of the two horses, and with a practised, quick flick of his strong hands, it was around her. She hung on for all that she was worth, and was dragged out of the clutches of the coal. He couldn't stop himself from smiling as he looked at her as she scrambled to her feet, scratched and bruised, bleeding from her shin, and whimpering in front of him. "You've got yourself in a right old pickle, and that's for sure. Black as the ace of spades you are. I'll get my missus to clean you up, and get you back to your house before your mum and dad find you missing." He looked at her in the way that the vicar would look at a naughty choir boy. "But if I was to clean you up and get you home, what are you going to give me? Nothing comes from nothing, and you've got to pay for my help. What have you got, young Bessie?" She was still clutching at her teddy, and there was no way that she would give him up. The only thing that she had was the apple. With dust-covered fingers, she pulled it from the pocket of her dress and put it in front of the farmer. An apple. A green apple. A ripe, green, juicy apple. "Well, I ain't no teacher, but I want to know where you got that apple from." Too frightened to speak, she nodded her head towards the manager's garden. The farmer sucked in his breath and looked for all the world as if he was going to sentence her to death for being a thief. But he couldn't hold his laughter in any more. "That'll do nicely, I think." Her hand looked so small compared to the great spade of a fist he had at the end of his arms, and before she knew it, he had put her up on the back of the great brown horse, and they were walking towards his old cottage. "This tastes all the sweeter 'cause you got it from them." He spat the words out, and the juice of the apple was on his unshaven chin. Bessie had wanted to give the apple to her father, but she was grateful for the help the farmer was giving her. See, she secretly hoped that he would let her have some, maybe half, perhaps a bite of the apple. But her hopes faded as he crunched and munched at the manager's apple. He saw this apple as a victory over those who had stolen his good pasture, and he was not going to share his moment of triumph with anybody. As the farmer's wife wrapped her up in a great woolen blanket, and watching her clothes dry by the farmer's roaring fire, Bessie asked if she could have at least the core of the apple. "Of course you can." The farmer smiled as he handed over the pips, stalk, and the last remaining flesh of the apple. "You be good now, and don't you turn yourself into no more talking coal." He chuckled as he went out to finish his work in the fields. True to his word, with the farmer's wife's help, she was back at home before anyone had noticed that she had gone, and she was slipped inside of her bed, with Ginny's razor-sharp, but somehow now friendly elbows digging in her ribs. At breakfast, her mother looked at Bessie in a strange way, for her daughter had woken up cleaner than when she had gone to bed, and Bessie, concentrating on her food, was not going to tell her about all or any of her adventures. What she did do was to put the pips into the warm soil at the back of the house, and as the years went by, the seeds became an apple tree that grew tall and strong, just as Bessie turned from a little girl to a kind and sensible woman. In the autumn sunshine, she would dance beneath its branches, loaded with fruit, and if she ever thought about having an adventure, she would touch the small, thin, blue, coal-dust scar at the front of her shin, and remember a little girl dancing amongst the buttercups and daisies. Old King Cole takes a devil of a toll, and a devil of a toll takes he. For he'll call for your life, and he'll call for your soul, and steal a father from his children 3. Old King Cole takes a devil of a toll, and a devil of a toll takes he. For he'll call for your life, and he'll call for your soul, and steal a father from his children 3. Old King Cole takes a devil of a toll, and the devil of a toll takes aid, for he'll call for your life, and he'll call for your soul, and steal a father from his children three. As soon as old Mrs. McGlasham came near to the pit, everyone started to panic. Managers, foremen, chairmen, workmen were all scared of this frail old woman. No one was spared her smile and her piercing eyes, yet her voice was as sweet as an angel's wing upon the air, and she looked as if she would never harm a fly. It was what she said and how she said it that really hurt. She could make the words, "You are no longer needed here, and you will leave this pit before the hour is done," sound as if she was asking you to dance a waltz at the Tivoli. Her hair was flame red, and although her back was bent, she could still make you feel as if you were a child again, as if you had been dragged to the headmistress's office to receive a severe caning. She knew very well the effect she had on all of these men, and she liked the way that her power made them quake and quiver. She had no doubt that they would spit out her name behind her back, not only for being so ruthless, but for the very fact that she was the boss of this place. What really brought a cheer to her heart was the fact that they despised her for the fact that she was a woman. Had it not been for the death of her husband, Sir Charles McGlasham, she would still have been nothing more and nothing less than the wife of the boss. Prior to her being made a widow, they never even gave her a glance, and now she was repaying them for their lack of courtesy by giving them some of their own medicine. "Good morning, gentlemen," she purred as a high-backed red plush velvet seat was placed for her at the head of the committee room. "It is so good to see that you are all busy. You know what my Charles would say now, don't you?" They did, but they squirmed as she took delight in repeating what her late husband had said. As she sat, she trilled, "A working pit needs to be filled with labour. From the darkness comes the light, and—" She looked into the eyes of these men who depended on her as the pit owner for their jobs. "And it is our job, to labour to bring the coal that brings the light to the working world." Fully rested in the seat, she clapped her hands, and the meeting began. "Remember, gentlemen, from the darkness comes the light." Outside of the oak-panelled doors, it was her voice that could be heard the most. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that this 89-year-old, strong-willed woman had a mind of her own in a male-dominated industry. The clapping of her grey-gloved hands signalled the end of the meeting, and as she handed the reports marked "Profits and Loss for the year ended 1910" to her chauffeur, she turned back, just in time to see the deputy manager cursing her. He nervously pulled at his moustache and cleared his throat, but she knew what he thought of her and a woman's ways. Still looking straight at him, she whispered, "Gentlemen, you know how much I enjoy your company on my weekly visits to the pit, and—" Here she almost smiled as she spoke. "And I look forward to seeing most of you next week. Goodbye, till Tuesday week." Many of the men almost fell over trying to bow as she went from the committee room, and as the door closed behind her, she could hear them bark and howl in pain as they thought that some of them may not be in her employment within the week. She took her chauffeur's arm as they made their way to the silver Bentley at the steps of the office. "Good. I like to keep them guessing. It means that they will all work and try and work extra hard to keep their jobs." What happened next took Emily McGlasham's breath away because, from out of nowhere, a pitman, straight from the coalface, rushed towards her with a box in his hand and a smile on his face. He hurriedly pulled his cap from his head, and she could see that under all of the coal dust he had straight brown hair. "Lady McGlasham!" He could barely speak, he was so excited. "Lady McGlasham! Lady McGlasham! I've made this for you!" He pushed a crudely made but beautifully carved wooden box towards her. She was shocked. She was more than shocked. She was outraged. She liked the money that the mine gave her. She loved the life that she had, with its fine wines and holidays in the sun. But this filthy pitman had the nerve to talk to her, and now expected her to take something that looked as if it had been made inside of his hovel. Benjamin Lomond was well known throughout the whole of the village for his fine craftsmanship. Many would have seen this as a great privilege, but Emily signalled to a chauffeur to take the box as she scurried into the car. Ben thought that she would like what he had given her. He was the third generation to have worked at the pit, and he was glad of the work that he and his father and grandfather had done for the McGlasham family. It was his way of showing the old lady how much he appreciated being able to keep a roof over his family's head. Putting his coal-heavy cap back on his head, he smiled to himself when he thought of what the old lady would say when she took a good look inside of the box he'd made. Lady McGlasham didn't utter a word until the middle of the evening. She had been silent in the dining room. She hadn't even complained about the food, which made the undercook very scared indeed. In fact, she and half of the scullery staff had packed their bags in anticipation of being cast out of the house the very next morning. It was as the last embers of the log fire were burning that she called for a driver to bring the box to her. As it was put down on the brass-topped table, she could tell that it was heavy, and despite herself, she was curious as to what mysteries it held. With the slightest wave of her fingers, she indicated that she wanted it to be opened for her. There was one thing that you could guarantee about a Ben Lomond box. It would have a finely made catch that would snap open with a satisfying click. Emily was curious, and she peered inside of the box to see that it was filled to the very brim with nothing more and nothing less than coal. True enough, they were the biggest pieces of coals that she had seen in a long time, but it was coal nonetheless. That stupid man brought coal to me. Am I not one of the richest women in Europe? Did the idiot not know that I have made my fortune with coal? There was more than anger in her voice. She was furious. If I knew what he looked like, I would have him sacked. With her small hand in a hard fist, she showed her servant that she wanted the box and its coal to be put on the fire. It crackled and burned with huge flames that leapt up the chimney and out and into the dark night. Ben still had a warm glow about him as he slowly went down the well-worn path on the back field to his house, knowing that he had finally shown his appreciation to the McGlasham family. When he had been a boy and was working on the screens, he had heard the old men curse the name of the mine owner. Even as a boy,
All he could think of was that, without their work, his family would have starved long ago. It had always been his ambition to give a present to the old man, but the old man had died before the box had been finished, and it was a stroke of luck that led him to find the pieces of coal. When you work in the dark, even the slightest flash of light can catch your eye, and as he had been hewing coal at the far end of the old workings, he saw something that looked like a door. And that's just what it was. A trapdoor. There were legends passed from mouth to ear, from father to son, from daughter to grandchildren, all about the old mine workings. Some said that it was the Romans, others said that it was even earlier than that. But there was always talk of treasure and monsters lurking in the dark. When he was a boy, he had enjoyed the stories as he sat by the firelight's glow on a Sunday evening. The whole family would listen to Granda Lowman as he sat in his favourite seat by the edge of the old leaded range, still in his best clothes for chapel, and he would give them the tales that he had been told when he was a boy. Ben enjoyed the stories, but he didn't believe them. Well, not until now. The back end of last Saturday's shift looked as if it was going to be just the same as any other, but something, maybe a light, perhaps a breath of air, but something made him look a little bit closer at the floor of the workings, and it was then that he saw the oak slats and lats of the trapdoor. Curiosity is a grand thing when it gives you a reward, and Ben was not disappointed as he slipped and slithered into the room, hidden for centuries and glowing with a glittering golden statue the size of your hand. He hadn't waited for a moment, and he never even thought of keeping it for himself. That's what I'll give her! That's what I'll give her to show her! His words were filled with pride and anticipation at what she would say when she saw it. The box had been just the right size, and he had slipped it under the large lumps of coal, and now that he had given it to the old woman, he slept like a little child.
From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light, friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. Once there was a mine here, but now the pit head's gone. There's no more working underground, but the memory lingers on. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light, friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light, friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. It was on the early shift that news passed about the town and the pit that Mrs. McGlasham was laying up in bed and could hardly move. Some of the men were glad to hear that she could hardly walk, not least of all was the deputy, who thought that he would at least have a job until the end of the week. Interfering old widow should keep her nose out of men's work. He was not alone in his happiness and his suffering. Many of the men almost danced at the news that after seeing every single doctor in the town, it looked as if she would never be able to walk again. Within the Lomond family, it was Ben who took it the worst, almost as if it had been his fault for giving her the small statue. As well as being a hard worker and a fine craftsman, he had listened carefully to all of his grandma's teachings,
She was well known for being able to cure the ricketiest of backs with her homemade lotions and potions. In a community where men spend half of their time bent double in the mine, she was well visited and well rewarded for her troubles. But it wasn't reward that filled his mind now. As soon as his shift was over, he was mixing and grinding goose-fat grasses, plantains and buttercups in his grandma's slate pestle and mortar. It was only after he was finished that he washed, dressed in his Sunday best, and ran to the old house. At first, the servants weren't going to let him in. It just wasn't done, not a pitman at the mine owner's house. But it was his insistence and persistence that drew the doctor's attention. At the leaded door to the magnificent house, he touched the downstairs maid on the shoulder and stood in front of her. "What is it? What do you want?" Ben was breathless, but he thrust the pot of his grand's cream as he pulled his Sunday cap off his head. "Doctor! Doctor! Here, take this. It'll work a treat on the mistress's back. It done all right for me grandfather, and it's done all right for me." The doctor raised an eyebrow and looked down his nose at Ben. He had seen him in chapel, and he knew where he lived. But his glower turned to a smile as he opened the pot and took a sniff of its sweet-smelling contents. There was a hint of meadow blossom and clear-running streams, and it filled the porch with its pleasing fragrance. "Now," the doctor spoke, "so you expect me to take this and put it onto Mrs. McGlasham's back?" Ben didn't speak, but he smiled and nodded his head. Dr. Burns pulled himself up to his full height and barked at Ben. "Be off with you, man! I've never heard anything so preposterous in all of my days. We've had all of the finest medical minds in the country looking after her, and there's nothing that can be done. Get away from here, and do not waste any more of my time." There wasn't a drop of a smile on his face as Ben watched the door being slammed in his face. He could see his reflection in the highly polished glass. "I might have known. The likes of the good doctor wouldn't listen to a miner like me." It was as he turned that he realised that the doctor he'd taken the pot, but he didn't want to cause any more trouble by asking for it back. He felt foolish and rejected as he made his way home. Once inside with Ben's pot, the doctor took some of it out and rubbed the cream on the back of his hand. "Who does he think he is? There is no room in this world for old-fashioned remedies." His talking stopped. Almost immediately he could feel a warmth spread to his fingers. The skin on the doctor's knuckles looked tighter, and he felt his hand relax, and all tension in his wrist disappeared. A slow smile passed over his thin face as he made his way upstairs to the old lady's bedroom. What could be the harm? She wouldn't need to know where it came from. News spread throughout the town about Mrs. McGlasham's miracle recovery. Ben was glad, and he hoped that she would soon be fit and well again. It wasn't very long after that, in the middle of Monday's second shift, that he was told to come to the offices. Thinking the worst, Ben Lomond practised what he was going to say to the deputy. He would have said anything to keep his job, to keep a roof over his family's head. It was worse than he could have imagined. She was sitting in the committee room, and she had his grand's pot in front of her. "The good doctor tells me that you gave him this." She pointed at the pot. "He also tells me that this pitman's poultice cured me." Ben was shaking as he stood before this formidable woman. He wanted to claim responsibility and the credit, but I got it out of him that you had the nerve to bring it to my house. Well, I have something to say to you." Her face was stern as she stood up to walk towards him. Ben had had enough. His words spilled from his lips. "Mrs. McGlasham, I was only trying to help. I thought that you would be glad of the help. But I was wrong. I gave you a present of a golden statue that I found, and I only wanted to say—" She raised her hand. "You have said enough. You might need to remember where you are and who I am." He was not going to be stopped. "I know very well who you are, and I know exactly where I am. I've always wanted to say that my family has been grateful to you and your late husband for the work that you have brought to us. I was only trying to say—" She had not been spoken to in this way for a very long time, but she had a smile on her face. "If you would let me finish, I have to give you this pot back, and with my thanks. You have given me the best present that any man could have given me. I can walk, and I even feel like I could run again. I simply want to give you the pot back with my thanks." She didn't know that the box had a statue in it. She felt terrible for having thrown such an ancient thing and a box of such beauty into the fire, but she was not going to tell this man before her now. She would look herself in the ashes for the melted gold as soon as this meeting had finished. "Please, just let me give you this pot back." Ben felt hurt that for all he had done for her, all she wanted to give in thanks was a pot that belonged to him in the first place. "I will say thank you to you, Mrs. McGlasham, and I hope that we meet in happier times. Good day." He took the pot and made his way out of the building, and was glad that he hadn't been sacked. He could hardly speak as he worked and finished his shift. Not really wanting to tell his wife about his shouting match with the mine owner, he looked in the pot. It had been cleaned, but there, under the coal dust from his work, he could see that there was an envelope. He scratched at his head and rubbed at his chin. "Who's written a letter to me? Fat lot of use that would do. I can't read more than my name. Still, better to see what's inside." By now, his wife's curiosity had been drawn to him, and she stood at his side as he ripped open the brown manila envelope. "Who's written to you, Ben?" There was concern and worry in her words. "Dunno. I just found this inside a grand slate pot." Ben might not have been able to read, but he did know his numbers. In amongst all of the scratchy, swirling writing, he could see the figure 5. It was followed by some notes. "It looks like Mrs. McGlasham's sent me a cheque for £5. That's good of her. £5 will go a long way for us." His wife looked closely. "I don't think it's £5. The old girl's given you looks more like £50. When they heard their parents talking about money, the children, Becky, Sam and Joseph, stood beside their mother and father. It was Becky who had paid the most attention at school, and she asked if she could have a look. Her eyes nearly burst out of her head. "This isn't for £5, ma'am. This isn't for £50 neither, Dad." She was shaking, and her tongue had gone dry. "This is for—" She really had the retention. "This is for £500. Silence crashed about them, crashed around them all, and it was only the sputtering of the coal in the grate that let them know that this wasn't a dream. £500? 500? £500? Ben gasped in between each of the words. Rebecca! Sam! Joseph! You know what this means, don't you? They looked blankly at their parents. This means that you'll have an education and you don't need to go down the mine. By now they were dancing and flinging their arms around each other. In the high part of the town, an old woman was scratching around at the back of the fireplace. In amongst the ashes, she found a piece of twisted, melted gold. She took it and placed it in her pocket, and from then on she carried it with her everywhere. Not that it was worth a lot of money, but she would hold it and remember to be gracious and kind, and perhaps, just perhaps she would try to be, as kind to those who had been kind and helpful to her.
From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. For ships and trains and iron, industry and home, we pull black diamonds from the earth. All hail to King Cole. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all played their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark.
Even though it was as black as night in the pit, Tom Grimstone knew that the sun was still shining in the clear afternoon air. He had watched the sun disappear from sight as he had gone down in the cage to the bottom of the F pit. He had smiled a broad, thin-lipped smile as he went underground, and he knew that his new, starched white vest would soon be as black as the coal he was going to dig. "What are you going to do about bait?" his friends all asked. They had been standing with him, kicking bits of broken shale with their steel-capped boots into the stinking pit pond before the afternoon shift. They had gasped as they watched him cut up his crust and chuck it to the sleek, white-feathered swan that had been unfortunate enough to land in the stained water at the pit head. It was true enough. Tom was hungry, but his grin became even wider on his open face as he spoke. "Now look, I don't mind cutting and shifting the coal, but there's no way that I'm going to eat it." He didn't want to embarrass his son by telling all of his mates that Jim Grimstone, 11 years old and as proud as punch to be at the pit, had forgotten to wash his hands when he had been making some sandwiches for his dad's birthday. The cage came to a juddering halt as Tom pulled his helmet and unlit candle onto his head, and had only just covered his straight brown hair. Tightening his father's old leather belt, he started towards the coal face as the last shift passed them in the darkness. They were like ghosts, coal-black ghosts, only seen to be men by the white of their black-rimmed eyes and bright teeth masked in grime. Some nodded as they passed, and others muttered a quick, "You're welcome to it," as they made their way out of the pit and into the world outside. Sometimes, just before he raised his weary arms and laid his pick into the coal seam, Tom thought it was all a dream, a long, bad, hard-working dream. It hadn't been that long since he was excited about going to the mine with his dad, but now it was hard work, back-breaking, knee-hurting, lung-choking, dangerous work. If there was any justice in the world, he would not be working today of all days, his birthday. He knew there was no choice. Only Sundays were a free day. Every other day was a work day. He quite liked the way that he was left to get on with his hewing and picking, but in the dark that surrounded him, he could have wished for a friend to talk to. He didn't want to gossip or waste time, just a friendly word here and there to break up the monotony of the crash of the pick against the shining coal. It would have made him feel better. By the light of the candle stub on his helmet, he thought he could see something glinting in the dark. 2 small, beady eyes were looking at him, and the snuffling sounds and the swish of the whiskers let him know that it was a rat. It wasn't that uncommon to find a big brown rat or a family of coal-coloured mice in amongst the broken rock on the pit floor. I know, I was wishing for a bit of company, but I didn't expect to see you. He was laughing as he spoke, and he realised that he was such a creature of habit that even the creatures that picked up the scraps of crust or cheese rind he would drop from his dinner knew when and where he would be. He reached for and rattled his empty bait box. It's empty today. All I had was some dusty sandwiches, and you'll have to have a fight with a swan if you want to get some now. His laughter was almost drowned out by his rumbling stomach. Even the thought of having to crunch at the coal dust on Jim's sandwiches made his stomach rumble. There's nought for you today. Just before he went to hold the heavy handle of his pick, he rubbed his hands on his clean white vest. He groaned. Well, that didn't last long now, did it? 2 dirty great handprints on me clean new shirt. I don't know why I bother. He was hungry. He was at work in a place that smelt of sulphur, dust and grime, and he was dirty and hot from the top of his freckled face to the tip of his black toe-capped boots. Anyway, I've wasted enough time with you. I'm going to have 'em on me back, the foreman, if I don't get a move on. His words came out slower and slower as he watched the rat slink away into the inky darkness. There was still something on the ground that glittered and gleamed, and it wasn't a pair of eyes. He blinked with his black-rimmed eyes, just to make sure that it was there, and quicker than a sigh he was on his knees and scraping at the floor of the tunnel. It didn't look like much, and Tom had worked in the pit for too long not to be surprised by anything that he found in the rubble. He had found fossils of plants and trees, and once he got a tooth of a tiger. At least he thought it was from a tiger. He'd only heard about them from a lad who'd been to sea. What he saw in the dark wasn't a plant, and definitely wasn't a tooth, but it was as big as a baby's thumb, and it had a look of glass about it. Well, I never did. It can't be. Not a... No, it wouldn't be. Couldn't be. Could it? His heart was racing as he looked at it. By the light of the spluttering candle on his helmet, it looked for all of the world like a crystal that he had seen in the mine owner's chandelier. Tom had gaped at the light when all of the men had been sent to the big house to sing carols for Christmas. That crystal had glittered and gleamed, just like this smooth, clear rock in his hand now. But there was no way that it could have come from the master's house. It couldn't be. Could it? His mind was racing when he thought of what it could be. Tom might not have been able to read, but he knew a good few things about the world. He knew that coal was made of carbon, and he knew that diamonds were made of carbon too. All it needs is a lot of heat, and a lot of squeezing, and you've got to... He looked around him and made sure that he was all alone, but still he whispered, and you've got a diamond? A diamond? It was all that he could do not to shout. He pushed the stone into his trouser pocket, and as soon as it was safe inside of his trousers, he did a little dance. His boots clattered in the echoing chamber, and it wasn't long before the foreman was watching him, his arms folded and one eyebrow raised. His deep, coal-laden voice broke the joy in Tom's heart. "If you ask me, they must be paying you too much. Either that, or the work's not hard enough. If you've got the energy to jig about like a lass on a May Day." The stone was burning a hole in Tom's pocket as he stood stock still in mid-dance. "Grimstone, get on with your walk. If you want to have a dance, then do it down at the Palladium, not on my time." Tom was wiping his hands on his vest again and praying that the foreman wouldn't ask him why he was dancing. The deep voice boomed again. "You are just as daft as your dad and his father before him. Get on with your walk, and no more shenanigans. Understood?" The foreman didn't wait for a reply. He knew that everybody did just as they were told, and didn't need to have a second telling. Working harder than ever to stop himself from thinking about the jewel in his pocket, Tom resumed his picking and cutting of the coal. It was a blessed relief when the shift was over, and he could look at his hidden treasure in the full light of the day. Just as he got to the pit head, he couldn't help himself as the light of the dying day on the horizon caught him in his eyes and made him sneeze. Without thinking, and in one movement, he reached for his handkerchief to blow at his dust-filled nose, and he dislodged the diamond from his pocket, and it clattered onto the ground at his feet. Tom's heart turned harder than the diamond, and he froze. "I don't think you need to take a piece of coal from the pit in your pocket now, do you?" The foreman was finishing his shift too, and he kicked Tom's prize towards the coal heap. His friends were laughing at Tom, but he could hardly believe his eyes. With the sweat from his work and the dust in his clothes, the gemstone had been coated in coal dust. It was completely covered and looked just like a small piece of coal. John Barber, Tom's next-door neighbour, was just about to throw it onto the pile of coal at the pit head when Tom dived and caught it in mid-air. Everyone was stunned at his antics, but Tom could only feel relief as he spoke. "Must have fallen in me pocket when I was down at the face. I think I'll call it my lucky piece of coal." He had the diamond now, deep in his pocket and covered by his strong hands. If the foreman was going to kick it onto the pile of coal, then he might as well have it as a burning fire, in someone's front parlour. All of his friends used to make fun of Tom, but he used the diamond well. He cut it up, bit by bit, and used it wisely. He bought a horse and a cart, a set of scales, and a lot of sacks. It wasn't long before he was the best-known coal man in the area. And even though he didn't go underground again, he would often be as black as the night, with only the white of his eyes to tell you it was him. Whenever you heard his horse and cart clopping and clattering down the street, everyone knew that they would get a fair measure of coal from Tom Grimstone and Son. The dark-eyed, ink-black, cold-hearted angel of coal waits and smiles in the gloom below. Frail men and boys struggle in their tombed night, scratching and scurrying like rats, raising their dust-stained arms to pull and pick at the flesh and veins of our long-dead sisters. A thin smile widens as the sweat stings their greedy, grave-robbing eyes. At a brow's wipe pause. Some think, some know, some fear that they can see her. But she cares not if they see her. She knows that she is too good for their sight. She stops to gloat by a young boy's side, blotting out the small guttering beam of a helmet's light. Safe is her knowledge that she will make them all pay for their thoughtless robbery of her sister's picked clean bones. Far away from the heart of a kingdom, far away from the danger of these hacked smooth catacombs, men and boys will feel her tightly closing powerful fingers as they struggle and gasp for breath. She laughs, full-throated in the echoing gloom, as a dark night, oily breath will fill their lungs as they step into the light. She can wait. She has always waited. She will take their bones in payment for the thieving of her sister's remains.
They were great days, them. Me and all of the lads would get up to all kinds of monkey tricks, I tell you. There was one time, it must have been just after the war, when me and Albie Boyens, we went up to the top of the pit shaft wheel, just for a lark, you know, a bit of a bet, and Dougie Carr was loving every minute of listening to his granddad's story of the pits. His granddad's stories were the best in the world, and he never got tired of telling them, and Dougie never got tired of hearing them. Every now and again the old man would have to stop to take a breath as they walked by the edge of the heath. His granda had worked hard and long, and somehow the pits came to life when he spoke about them. All that was there now to show that there'd ever been any mine was a sculpture of the pit wheel. There was some green grassland and a lot of heather and gorse. Where was I? Oh yes, Albie Boyens was a bit of a one for heights. Most people say that they don't like heights. Well, not Albie. Not Albie Boyens. He loved them. He wasn't keen on going down below in the pit shaft, but if there was a chance to go up a height, then Albie was your man. So, there we were, up on the top of the pit wheel, and who's coming along but the chairman of the board, all la-di-da in his best suit, all the way from Darlington. Albie couldn't breathe for laughing, and I was so scared I started to giggle, and then the chairman, I forget his name now, but he starts to look up. His granda started to slow down in his speech and his walking. To show him that he was still interested in the story, Dougie turned around and started to walk backwards, so that he could watch his granda talk. It was then, as he wasn't able to look at the path behind him, that he tripped up and fell to the ground like a limp sack of potatoes. It knocked the air out of his lungs, and he felt a little bit foolish to see his granda have to reach down and pick him up. Now that he was 13, it was a bit of a struggle for the old man to lift him up to his feet. Doug could hear his breath fighting in his lungs as he held him to his chest. It didn't seem that long ago that he'd ridden on his granda's shoulders when he'd been a toddler. Old workmates and men from the pit had all waved to him and had ruffled Dougie's hair. They'd all shaken their heads and smiled. Too bad the young'un won't be able to follow in his granddad's footsteps. Terrible times these, aren't they? It was on the news, and when he was at school he heard about the pit strike, and he wondered why they were fighting to go down the pit. His dad said that he was glad that he wouldn't have to work in that stinking great hole. He said that there was other work to do, better work that didn't make you choke, or leave your wife thinking that each morning would be the last time that she would see you. Trying to get his own breath back, Doug could see what it was that had made him trip up. It was a tin, about the size of a small loaf. As they stood side by side, the old man was laughing. I didn't think I'd see the day when I'd have one of these in me hands again. Granda Carr was dusting the rusty box down and sucking at his gums. Well, I never did. Send me to the bottom of our stairs. His grandad
was always saying things that made no sense to Doug. "Send me to the bottom of our stairs and back again. It's a bait box." His grandson was looking on in awe as the old man, eventually plucked up the courage to ask him just what a bait box was. "A bait box? You don't know what a bait box is, for crying out loud. What did they teach you at that fancy school of yours?" He was concerned, but there was still a touch of laughter in his words. He looked down, and he looked this perplexed boy in the eyes. "Look, when I was your age, I left school, and I was down the pit and on the face by the time I was 14. As soon as I left school, I was a man, and a man who worked needed to have something in his belly to keep him going all day. A bite to eat, a bit of grub, a bit of bait. And if you were lucky, then you got some leftover dinner. Not that there was very much leftovers, ever. And you might have got a slab of bread, and that is what you ate. Your bait. Well, you couldn't very well carry it in your pocket, so your wife or your mother or your sister, put your bait in a tin, a box, a bait box, and that, my fine Douglas." Douglas hated being called Douglas. It usually meant that he had done something wrong, but still he listened, fascinated by his grandfather's words. "And that, my fine Dougie, me boy, is what a bait box is. You were holding in your hot little hands a bait box." Doug felt the tin very carefully, and he could tell that there was something inside, and whatever it was hard and gave a satisfying ring in the air. He shook it again, just to make sure. His mind was racing. He had dreams of treasure, riches, money, and he had already spent his first £1,000 when his granda took the box from his hands. "Let's have a look inside. I've got a feeling I know what they are." With a quick flick of his arthritic fingers, the bait box was opened, and inside there were 2 pieces of metal. They looked like big brass coins and had some numbers and letters stamped on them, and a hole at the top. "What are they, Granda? Are they money? Are they important?" Doug was curious and bit his lip as he asked the very important question. "Are they worth a lot of money?" The laugh that came from the old man's throat was deep and sounded as old as the hills they were stood on. He laughed so much that it started him coughing. This was a sound that the young boy didn't like. It seemed to come from his grandfather's boots, and racked him with pain and twisted his face so that he didn't look as if he'd ever be able to breathe again. Waving his hand in the air and clutching at his chest, Granda Carr eventually started to speak again. "Oh, aye, they're important, all right. They're your tally." He paused to breathe again. "You had to hang them up as you went down the pit, and that way—" Another laboured clutch at a breath. And that way the deputy knew who was on the shift and where they were. There weren't any worth any money in the shops, but if you lost them, you didn't have a job." Still coughing, the old man sat down by the side of the path, and the boy sat down beside him. He was concerned at just how red his grandfather's face was, and just how much it hurt him to breathe. "Granda?" His voice was curious. "Granda, you make it sound like working in the mine was one of the best things that you ever did. I'd like to go down the mine. I'd like to have adventures, just like you and Albie." The old man smiled. "Oh, it was the best of all times. When you had a job down the pit, you had a job." He cleared his throat, and some spittle hung at the corners of his mouth. "You had a job for life. Not like now. No pits and no jobs." In the left-hand pocket of the old man's jacket there was a rolled-up newspaper. He pulled it out and opened it. "Mind, I've seen that there's plenty of pit work in Poland. Some good work in mines over there. Plenty of jobs and a good life down the pit." Dougie's eyes lit up. Do you think I could get a job down the pit in Poland?" He was stammering in excitement at the idea of following in his granddad's footsteps. "As soon as I get away from school, then I'm going to go to Poland, and I'll work in a real mine." The smile on his face let you know that he was proud of his grandson, and he hugged him close. "You know, I've still got a few connections in the Union, or what's left of it. Perhaps I could swing it with Václav to get you a job out there." "Over my dead body!" There was no doubt about the anger in the voice behind them. Grandfather and grandson turned around to see Jim Carr, Doug's father, and Jimmy Carr Sr.'s son. He had his left hand on his hip, and the other hand was pointing straight at his own father. "Over my dead body will you get in touch with your friends in Poland. You've been filling the lad's head up with nonsense about how great it was in the pit. Listen to yourself. You can barely walk 100 yards without getting out of breath." He was moving closer to them both. "You've got half of the colliery in your lungs, and you can't sleep for coughing, and you—" The finger was pointed almost full into the old man's face. "And you are trying to kid my son, your grandson I might add, to go down there. I've a good mind to knock your block off. Don't fill the lad's head with these fairy tales. Don't get his hopes up." You could almost hear Jim Carr count to 10. His shoulders relaxed, and he put his arm around his son's shoulders as the old man and he stood up. "Look, Douglas. Doug! It's all well and good listening to these old stories, and your grandad did have some good times, but it was hard work." He turned to his father to get some assurance. "Look, Dad, it was hard, wasn't it? Think about all of the times you came off the back shift, and there was no hot water, and you had to go to bed still covered in coal dust." Jimmy Carr Sr. was nodding. "Aye, you're right. Listen to your dad, son. He is right. It wasn't all adventures a lot of the time. It was hard, bloody hard work, and it was the pit that took the breath out of me body." Now he turned to his son. "Look, Jim, you cannot get vexed at an old man and his dreams, now can you? I didn't mean to fill his head with dreams. It's just that it seems such a shame that we've had 5 generations of Carrs working in the pit, and now your lad—" Jim Carr raised his hand and spoke slowly and carefully to his father. "That's just it, Dad. He's my son, and I don't want him to ruin his health in that mine, either here or in Poland." It was as if the grandfather had become the son, and he bowed his head and cleared his throat. "You're right. I didn't mean to undermine you." He turned to Doug. "Don't listen to me. I'm just an old man with some stupid dreams. Dreams nearly as old as that tin." With the sudden appearance of his father, Doug had forgotten about the bait box. His dad turned and looked at the bait box. "Why, I never did! A bait box? Where did you get that?" With the argument over, it was a wonder to see the 3 of them laughing and joking and telling stories about the terrible bits of bait that they had had when Grandfather and Jim Carr Jr. had worked side by side. As the evening drew in, the 3 generations of Carrs made their way home, and Dougie's father spoke to the grandfather. "You know these things, bait boxes, tallies and that. They make a good price these days at boot fairs. I think there's one on this Sunday. Do you fancy going with Doug and me?" "Why, of course I do. I've got a whole load of that kind of stuff in the attic. Your mama'd be glad of the space. I'll see what I can do." The day of the boot fair was a big success. A couple of local museums came for the bait box and the tally discs. Granda Carr was more than amazed at the way the rubbish of helmets, lamps, leggings, elbow pads and shift books he'd kept for so many years raced off the stall. Jim and Doug couldn't count the cash fast enough, and best of all, a teacher from Doug's school asked if the old man could come in to tell the children some of his amazing stories. When they came to finally packing up the stall and counted the money, it was Granda Carr who was about to put the money into Doug's hands. "I've never seen anybody work as hard as you have, son. You've made your Granda proud today, but..." Doug never liked it when his Granda said "but." It always meant that he was going to say something serious. "But, and it's a big but, you've got to tell me that this is the only money you're ever going to make from the pit." Doug smiled, looked over his shoulder at his father. "I promise. I like your stories, Granda, and you've got to promise something for me. Promise me that you won't stop telling them." The two of them stood by the side of the boot fair and looked at all of the litter blowing in the breeze and shook hands to seal the deal.
From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and family, workmates brought the light from the dark. For ships and trains and iron, industry and home, we pull black diamonds from the earth. All hail to King Paul. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. No one talks of danger underneath the ground. We're the heartbeat of this nation, of that we can be proud. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. Now once there was a mine here, but now the pit has gone. There's no more working underground, but the memory lingers on. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and family, workmates brought the light from the dark. Now the pit is closing, Mother Nature takes a hand. There's no more filthy slag heaps in this green and pleasant land. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and families, workmates brought the light from the dark. For ships and trains and iron, industry and home, we pull black diamonds from the earth. All hail to King Paul. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Friends and family, workmates brought the light from the dark. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers all play their part. From the darkness to the light, from the darkness to the light.